I'm in the city of Westminster in Langham Place in front of the BBC and All Souls, the famous evangelical church where John Stott held the pulpit for so many years. Bishop Michael Nazir Ali has agreed to speak to me today. I'm very interested in the perspective and contribution that he has in terms of understanding the growing secularization of the society in the UK. Bishop Michael Nazir Ali, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me this afternoon.
It's good to see you.
I've often wondered about the interface between the two buildings between us, the BBC, this giant corporation that plays such a significant role in our culture and society, and a famous evangelical church where, of course, John Stott held the pulpit for so long. Do you have any thoughts about the relationship between the two?
Well, yes, I first came to know this church when John Stott was the rector and often visited John here. So many memories of that, and also when Michael Bourne was here. And the BBC have a long tradition of using this church for music, for worship, for all sorts of things. So it's not just that they're side by side, but there is actually a connection between the two, which is a good thing, because it means that the BBC take account of the church, and the church, of course, knows that it is on the doorsteps of the BBC.
And yet it seems to me there's a difficult relationship between growing secularism in the church today, or in the country, and the position of the church. Do you think that that's true?
Yes, I think there is a growing secularism, but it is a secularism that has not examined itself on the whole, and there are also very significant vestiges of the Christian faith that remain important for national life, and they too very often are unexamined.
It seems that secularism is posing a significant threat to many people who would come from a faith position in our country today. Is there a particular way that might be helpful for such people to look at these new realities that we are faced with?
Secularism is a new threat to this country, but quite often it relies on Christian values without acknowledging them as Christian values. So one of the things is to point out what secularism is living on, which is vestiges of the Christian heritage of this country. And if those were not around, secularism would look even more hollow than it does today. And for Christian people to know this and to point it out from time to time is very important, I think.
Do you think that there is such a thing as balancing a secular world with a so-called sacred world, or a world where faith is central?
Well, there's no neutrality. I mean, I think the pretense of neutrality has to be challenged. We all have a world view, each one of us, and of course some people acknowledge their worldview and some don't. And so I think it is to point out that secularism is also a worldview, and its presuppositions need to be examined and sometimes challenged. But having said that, if the nation wants one of these new realities that you're talking about to be acknowledged, then it must also acknowledge that other people may have a different view, and to accommodate them, to respect properly formed consciences. That is very important, I think, if a free society is going to be maintained and to flourish.
I suspect that many would argue that we are emerging out of considerable imbalance in terms of the dominance of the Judeo-Christian values in Britain. What would you say to that?
Well, many Judeo-Christian values remain fundamental to us, the dignity of the human person, for instance. But what people don't know is how these values came to be our values, and that is something the church ought to be doing is to show people where the connections are, and the church itself has not always done that. Of course, there are other Judeo-Christian values that are being challenged or even rejected, and once again the church has to say why they are important.
Thank you very much.
There are a number of dangers that are facing our societies. The founder of the World Economic Forum, for example, says that the main danger facing Europe today is what he calls intergenerational communication. So he says the generations communicated with one another, for example, in church or in school or at home. And none of that is happening today. People aren't going to church, so the generations are not meeting there. The family is disintegrating at a rapid rate, so there's no communication there. It seems from some definitions that anyone who shares a fridge is family, but that of course doesn't make for good communication. So that's certainly one great danger if wisdom and experience is not being transmitted. Of course, he sees it very much in economic terms, but we can also see it in social and moral and spiritual terms.
What do we learn from the history of the Jewish nation?
One of the things that's quite clear from the Bible is that what the Jews received from God was very often countercultural. It went against the received cultures of the Middle East at that time. For example, in the way in which men and women related to one another, how the stranger was treated, what limits there were to those who were rulers. I mean, in all of those things, the Jewish people turned out to be countercultural. And in Europe today, the church particularly has to think about that, how to relate positively to culture where it can do so, but where it can't, how to resist capitulation to culture, which can of course be very strongly demanded.
Are our Jewish roots important then as modern believers and Europeans?
Well, the Jews gave us, for instance, our notion of time. You know, all the other ancient religions and even modern ones are cyclical in their view of time. Time goes round and things that have happened before happen again and so on. But the biblical view of time, quite uniquely, is open, progressive, developmental. So we owe that for a start to the people of the Bible. But we owe many other things. I mean, the idea of inalienable human dignity, which is found in so many charters for human rights today, is rooted in the idea that God made man and woman in His image. Respect for that dignity and therefore for human life at every stage of its development. The biblical emphasis on one flesh union between man and woman as the basis for the family and therefore as the basis for society is also absolutely fundamental to the flourishing of any society, including European ones. What we have to understand is that there is no such thing as neutrality. So any claim by secularism to be neutral has to be resisted. Secularism is, of course, a worldview like any other worldview. And the question is whether it should be allowed a kind of controlling influence in any society. If, however, society decides to go in a particular direction, which is not, for instance, one that Christians could take, then the question of balance will arise. For example, in the redefinition of marriage, clearly society in the shape of Parliament has decided to go in that direction of what they call equal marriage. And that means that in terms of balancing rights, some provision has to be made for conscience where believers are concerned, and that doesn't just mean Christian believers. I mean, most other religions of the world will take a view on marriage and family that is contrary to this redefinition. So an allowance for conscience has to be very widely cast. And there is a long tradition in Britain of respecting conscience. Even in times of war, conscientious objection has been respected. I'm not a great fan of the Abortion Act of 1967, but even that respects conscience, though the interpretation of that is increasingly being restricted by the judiciary. And the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act also respects conscience. So why have we suddenly reached a stage where conscience is not even acknowledged in legislation, let alone respected? The other aspect of this necessity of balancing rights of different groups in the community is what we might call reasonable accommodation. And this is much more an American idea. It stems from the First Amendment to the American Constitution about freedom of religion, and also actually from the civil rights legislation of the mid-20th century. And the idea of reasonable accommodation is that people's beliefs must be respected at the workplace. If they do not jeopardize the business that is being conducted or a service that is being delivered. So again, this is something that we need to learn from. Again, not just for Christians, but for wide sections of the community, reasonable accommodation of belief and the manifestation of belief at the workplace, but also, of course, in other areas, for example, in volunteering or in running voluntary agencies. That is where reasonable accommodation needs to be made.
What are the fundamentals of faith and godly living Europeans should work to defend in the public domain?
Yes, I was saying to a man this morning, in fact, who said to me, a complete stranger I met, and he said that he had lost his faith. So I said, well, you know, what you're talking about is a very serious business, because it's not just faith that you've lost, but a way of looking at the world, a way of looking at the human condition. How are you now making sense of the world and of yourself? So we need the Christian faith for ourselves to make sense of our own life, of course, but also of the world, of society. And in the nation, in this nation particularly, in Britain, even if the nation decides that it does not want to have an established church, which it may do, even if it decides that, the Judeo-Christian tradition in terms of a starting point for moral thinking, you know, in legislation, again and again in Parliament, issues are raised that have a moral dimension about the sanctity of the human person, for instance, about how to structure the family, about justice in society. I mean, all of those things. Where are we going to start if we don't have any moral or spiritual tradition that is acknowledged? So I would say that personally we need a spiritual and moral vision to order our own lives. But society also needs a starting point for moral thinking in a fast-changing world. I mean, science is going to produce moral dilemmas for us at an exponential rate, and we will always be catching up. But if we have no vantage point, as it were, then we will not be able to make the right decisions.
It seems to me that Europe hasn't always received Christianity well. What are your thoughts on this?
The Romans, of course, persecuted the Christians for 300 years and more. And the Roman Empire was one of the few civilizations in history that had cruelty for pleasure. And many Christians, of course, met their deaths in the arena, not just being executed for whatever crimes they were accused of, but for the pleasure of the circus, of the elite as well as the plebeians. Christianity changed Europe completely. I mean, what we see now is the result of the Christian faith. Even Roman law, which became important later on in the history of Europe, was actually Christianized Roman law of Justinian and Theodosius, not the pagan Roman law under which the Christians suffered. Christianity invented the person. Before that, we had tribal religion, we had family religion, we had national religion, we had the worship of Caesar. That, of course, was one of the reasons why Christians were so often condemned, was their refusal to worship Caesar. But we didn't have this idea that people need a personal relationship with God, and that demanded the invention of the person. So what we see around us, our view of human rights, of the value of the human person, all of this we owe to the arrival of Christianity. And so much of so-called pagan civilization that we receive today has been refracted to us through a Christian lens, and therefore, as Pope Benedict used to say, purified.
If paganism was purified, what's then happening in the refraction process that's problematic?
One of the things that pagan husbands used to be worried about was their Christian wives going to the disreputable parts of the cities. Well, why were they going there? They were going there to rescue prostitutes, to bury paupers, to buy the freedom of slaves, to save female children left exposed to die. See, that's the kind of thing that Christianity did. You may call it the option for the poor or the marginalized, that changed society wherever Christianity went. People think that Europe discovered suddenly in the 19th century that slavery was wrong. This is not the case at all. I mean, St. Anselm, then Archbishop of Canterbury, declared that slavery was wrong when he was Archbishop in the 12th century. And he forbade the practice of slavery under pain of excommunication. And that, of course, is why slavery died out in Europe and indeed in Britain, so that when escaped slaves from the Caribbean, from across the Atlantic, arrived in Britain, there was no law to judge whose property they were or whether they were property. And that, of course, created a new situation. But the reason why there was no law was because there was no slavery. And the reason there was no slavery was because of Christianity. So it is incalculable what Europe owes to Christianity, and its constant denial to an observer looks most astonishing.
It seems today that we're being taught that modern society has learnt something new about sexual ethics that was unknown to the early Christians. What are your thoughts about this?
We have to distinguish very carefully between real new knowledge and alleged new knowledge. I mean, there is real new knowledge. We do know some things now that our forefathers did not know. Just to take an example, we know a great deal more about the early embryo than even our parents did, probably. But then sometimes knowledge is claimed for what is merely opinion or preference. There was a school of philosophy in this country, a very important school of philosophy in the 60s and 70s, called realism, which wanted to base ethical decision making in how things are, not in how we may want them to be to satisfy our desires. And I think we have, by neglecting that kind of view of the task of ethics and philosophy, lost quite a great deal.